Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about setting up your DC stick welding machine. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Real quickly before we start setting everything up, I want to go over some of the tools that you're going to want for stick welding. Your primary tool that you're going to want is a chipping hammer like this one. There's a couple of different orientations, just about any of them will work. For the most part, you're going to be using the spiky side on the back side. This is so that you can chip away the slag that comes from stick welding. There's a whole bunch of other chipping tools out there. The most efficient one that I have found so far is this chipping hammer, so I definitely recommend picking one up. Ideally, the smaller the point, the better, I find. That's just for me, but get yourselves a good chipping hammer. You'll be using it a lot. Now here, you'll see that I have a modified saw blade with a post welded onto it, and I use this for scraping away all the BBs. I understand that some of you probably won't have access to a industrial grade saw blade like this, so if nothing else, one of these little chisels generally works out just fine. But this is kind of a secondary thing depending on how clean you want it, and there's a lot of shops, if you start doing this professionally, they'll want it pretty clean. So definitely recommend a scraper of some sort. And then here I've got an assortment of different brushes depending on how tight of a corner I need to get into. It's really nice for brushing away all the stuff that gets left behind by the weld, and it'll help you find little slag pockets that might be left over. So definitely recommend a brush. And finally, pair of pliers. Guess what? When you get welding, those welds get hot. That metal will get hot. In fact, you can kind of see on my pliers, the tips of these ones are a little bit heat treated from working with hot metal all the time. So get yourself a pair of pliers. You're not going to want to grab hot metal even with the gloved hands, because hot metal is very good at burning through your gloves. Speaking of gloves, don't forget all your safety gear. Helmet, coat, gloves, safety glasses. Don't forget them. Alright guys, let's go ahead and start setting up the machine. I apologize for the noise, but as you probably know, weld fans are essential for your welder, so we're just going to have to enjoy the noise. As you can see, I have an Everlast welder. This one is a multi-process unit, so I have a whole bunch of settings that I can do on it. So let's get it over into stick mode. As you can see, I'm already on stick mode. I have a whole bunch of other options there, but I'm already on stick. Now, looking at that, you can see that I have a whole bunch of options that I can adjust. We're going to go ahead and skip those for now, because I'm betting a lot of machines don't have this many options. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw it into synergic mode. So I'm going to push that button, and it's going to bring this up. Now, you can see that I'm already set on 6011, and as some of you guys might remember from the last video, I'm running an 1/8 inch. You'll notice that says 3/32. I'm going to leave it there because personally I think that it runs a little bit better on this setting than it does on the 1/8 inch setting. So 6011, 3/32. Don't worry about that. I just think that it runs better. If you are running a synergic machine, most synergics will have a material. This is just the thickest material I can go on this setting. And the part that all of you really want to pay attention to is the amperage. Okay? For those of you who don't have machines as fancy as this, you're going to have an amperage reading. This is the main thing you want to set. 6011 and 6010 and 6013, all in an 1/8 inch rod, generally you start at about 90. You start at 90. And then you kind of figure out how your machine runs. Now, I've done some work with my machine, so I know that on this setting, I want to crank this up to about 100. That's for my machine. That's been probably the best looking bead that I've gotten so far with this machine, but start at 90 and then work your way up, and we'll see where you end up at. Okay guys, so I went ahead and turned off the machine so that I could talk to you guys a little bit about technique and how you want to run your 6011 rods. So this here is your electrode clamp. Some of you might have some slightly different ones, that's okay, but this is the one that I have. Now, for me, I usually like to set my rod in here at a 90 degree. That's normally where I set it, unless I'm doing an uphill weld. And we can get into that some other time. But normally I like it at a 90 degree. Big point is try and figure out where it's most comfortable. Hopefully you guys can see in there, but there's a whole bunch of grooves in your usual electrode clamps right there. This is so that you can angle the rod. So while I like putting mine at a 90 degree, you are more than welcome to try at like a 45 degree, like that. Find what is comfortable. For me, my comfortable spot is at a 90 degree, like that. Now, when you go to run this rod, there's a little bit of a technique to it. And remember, this applies to 6011. Get a good, comfortable grip on the electrode holder. And when you go, make sure that that doesn't have any charge left in it. But when you go, usually on a 6011, when you strike your arc, you're just going to tap it and release. Just tap and release. That is the usual way, or the way that I generally like to strike an arc with a 6011, is just tap it and come back up a little bit. It takes a little bit of practice to get good at it, because you got to tap, come up a bit, and then come back down. It takes practice. Do not feel discouraged if you stick the rod. If you stick it, just either turn off the machine or pop it out of the electrode clamp. If you stick it, that's okay. It's all part of the learning process. And then just break it off as you go. Most of the time when I stick, I'll get it stuck, and then I can just wiggle my electrode holder back and forth a bit till it breaks off. And then I come back in and try again. If you are having difficulties just tapping it to get it to strike an arc, there is also the scratch start method, which is you come down and you gently scratch off the surface. So it'll usually be something like that. Sometimes that works, sometimes that helps. Kind of depends on your rod. For the most part, mine's a tap. Now, when you get to running this, you want to do what's called a drag angle. So this would be straight up and down. You want to tilt it a little bit, and you want to drag that rod along. Just drag it along, okay? Sometimes also known as a backhand. Forehand on these. So if I were to try and go this way, generally doesn't work. The rule of thumb is if it has slag, like your stick rods do, then you want to drag it. Slag is a drag. Versus like MIG, that doesn't have slag, or at least the solid wires don't have slag. MIG doesn't have slag, so generally you want to push it. But for the purposes of stick, we are going to be dragging. So, there's that. Now, 6011 and 6010 tend to run a little bit different than the 7000 series, like your 7018 or your 7014. Remember, these rods are a little bit lower deposition. So, as you're going to strike your arc, you're going to get it to stabilize, and then you're going to run what's called a whip technique. So, this means that you go forward and then back, forward and then back, forward and then back. Forward and then back. A lot of this is to do with the lower deposition, and you want to get your two plates to join together properly. Remember how we were talking in the last video that sometimes your 7018 doesn't join your plates too well? It's partially because of that deposition. So, strike an arc, keep a drag angle on it, and I have a bit of angle coming back towards me. Kind of depends on what joint you're in, but you want to generally kind of travel in the angle of your rod. Try and keep that pretty parallel there. And then just back and forth, back and forth. Takes a little bit of practice, but when you get good at it, you'll be making some good beads. So let me go ahead and throw on my safety gear, and then we'll go ahead and run a bead and kind of show you what it looks like. Alright guys, so as you can see I swapped my pieces of metal. This one's just a little bit better for me. But there's the bead that I ran. Now, I know the camera doesn't pick it up quite good, but you can kind of see there's a whole bunch of black stuff over it. That is the slag that I've been talking about. And that is where your chipping hammer comes in. So let's go ahead and chip that. Headphone users, beware, this might be a bit loud. just go ahead and chip that off right like that. There you go. So, pretty happy with how this bead came out. Again, it's kind of hard to see on the camera. Let me go ahead and brush that. Set down the camera here for a second. Alrighty. And come on, focus. There's the bead right there. Now you can tell I kind of put this on top of a bunch of other test beads, but I got a limited amount of metal, so I got to make do what I can. Now, some of you will be noticing that I am not wearing gloves. And I specifically told you to wear gloves because metal is hot. Here's what happened. I ran this bead and then got a call from some of my family to go do dinner. So I ran the bead and then went and did dinner. And so my part has had a couple of hours to cool off since then. But, as you can see, hopefully, oh, come on, camera. Yeah, hopefully in the future we can afford a better camera. But, there it is. That's your 6011 bead right there on top. So you notice how I was kind of whipping it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That gives it that kind of stacked look right there. Now, what you want to pay attention to when you do this is up here at the toe, make sure your toe is very well tied in. You don't want it to create an indentation into the metal. That's called undercut. But you do want it to be tied in and fairly smooth with both your top plate and your bottom plate. This one's very good. I like how this one came out. I can almost run my finger across it and not even tell the difference between the two beads that I have on here. So, there you go. That's how you run 6011. Remember, it takes a bit of practice to get good at it, so don't feel discouraged if it's pretty hard at first. It was pretty hard at first for me too. But that's how you do it. So, hope you guys learned something, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace. Hey guys, this is Welding Ep2 from the future, who thought that he was done with the video, but realized that past Welding Ep2 forgot to mention something. So, when you guys were watching me run that arc, you probably noticed that right at the end, I broke off the arc, and then came back and restarted it for just a brief moment. I want to touch on that real quick. So what happens when you're stick welding is usually right at the end of your bead, you're going to have what's called a crater. This was kind of a secondary thought to me because I've been doing this long enough that filling in the craters is just second nature to me. So that's what that was. Now, I'll be able to show it a little bit better when we get into the 7018 video, just what a crater is, assuming I can override my instincts to fill it in at the end. But when you finish your bead, what you'll usually do is you'll either come in from the other side and weld into the bead, or you'll do what I did in the video and restrike right at the edge and just fill that crater in. So, future Welding Ep2, fixing the mistakes of past Welding Ep2 and making sure to explain that. So, remember that when you're running, when you get to the end, break off your arc. And if this was a solid plate and I was doing a weld all the way through, I'd probably break it off in the center here and then come from the other side and meet it in the middle to fill that crater. But as it is, I was just doing a short bead to kind of show you. So I just came back in, restarted the arc, put down a little bit of metal, and broke it off again. And that's called filling your crater. So remember to fill your craters. And in the next video, when we start running 7018, I'm hoping it'll be a little bit easier for me to explain that. So, stay tuned for the next video. Peace!